Okay, welcome everyone to this year's third and final Pufendorf lecture with Professor Jonathan Dancy. We have already learned a lot for 2 days, and now we look forward to getting to know what Pritchard's problem was. Yes. And possibly how to solve it. There was a question mark in the title, but hopefully.
The question mark was intentional. Please. Right. Before I start, let me say what a pleasure it has been to be here. I've always thought of this department as one of the very best departments to be in, and it proved to be so. It's because of obviously because of the people that you're lucky to have. Some of them are quite old, and others are less old. But the general atmosphere here seems to me absolutely admirable, and I think you're extremely lucky. Don't change anything. So this is about a problem that I found in Harold Pritchard. Harold Pritchard was an English moral philosopher working in Oxford in the first half of the 20th century, for whom I had the deepest possible respect. Very, very subtle thinker, alert to the tiniest nuance, and very hard to read because you have to go so slowly, or you miss it. But before I get to the problem, let me say where we are so far, as it were, and some professions of faith, which means I'm not going to give any arguments. So according to me, reasons to act or to believe, I don't know exactly the same story on the cognitive side as on the moral side, according to me. Reasons to act are matters of fact or states of affairs or features of the situation which favor a certain response. So we have matters of fact, favor, response. The reasons for which we act are not restricted to our own psychological states that I talked about in my first talk, and they are not propositions either. That was the second. And when we act for a reason, we act in the light of, a sort of supposedly well-chosen metaphor, favorable, in the light of a consideration. And of course, the metaphysical status of considerations is something one might wonder about. Hopefully, it's a matter of fact. But of course, it might not be when you act because of something about which you're mistaken. That can happen. You act in the light of a consideration as favoring. So it's a favorable light that this consideration casts on so acting. That's the basic story. And I think of this favoring relation as one about which it's not possible to say a very great deal, since it's too basic. But it's not itself evaluative, according to me. I think that it's, if one wants a term for what it is when it's not evaluative, I say normative. But that doesn't really mean to say it has much to do with norms, if you think of norms as rules or directions, directives, or anything like that. We're just dealing with an ordinary reason here. There aren't any norms necessarily with such a thing, or directives, or anything like that. Something else is being done by the reason than directing or demanding or requiring or any of those things. And you could hardly say that the reasons advise you, because no individual reason even does that. It would have to be a sort of contributory bit of advice, which might be another reason that advised the other thing. So I don't think advising is the right metaphor. I don't like that. According to me, a reason is not a consideration that increases the value of something. So we're not dealing with value here. Which leads to I'm wondering what you are dealing with, if it's not better making. And effectively, I take the rather pessimistic view that there's not much to be said about the favouring relation, other than keeping it carefully distinct from other relations. I don't really see any prospect of a successful analysis. But we used to think that analysis was everything when we did analytic philosophy. But we've all, I think, grown up a bit And don't think that analysis is everything. Nice though analyses are when they're available. But there's absolutely no reason why the interesting things should be able to be analysed into parts. To analyse is to break up, really. To loosen. So the favouring relation is the driving consideration in my view. So I asked myself about the nature of that relation. And in particular, what lies on the right-hand side of it? What is it that is favoured? That's what this talk is about. However, I start by a problem that I found in Harold Pritchard. So you need to read this. Everyone's got a copy of this handout? Read along, because with Pritchard you have to go carefully. But, he said, as we recognize when we reflect, which isn't always true, of course, but as we should recognize when we reflect. As we recognize when we reflect, there are no such characteristics of an action as ought to be doneness or ought not to be doneness. This is obvious. For, since the obligation to do some action cannot possibly depend on actual performance of the action, the obligation itself cannot be a property which the action would have if it were done. This is obvious. For since the obligation to do, whether you're obliged to do it cannot depend on whether you do it, surely. That's a good premise. Therefore, the obligation itself cannot be a property which the action would have if it were done, since it would still have it even if it weren't done. That sounds reasonable. You can't, as it were, defeat an obligation by simply not doing the thing. It's still what you ought to do. Still, okay, so this is typical Pritchard language. Okay, ought to be doneness. So what does it mean? Well, the obligation to do the action cannot depend on actual performance, because whether we do it or not is irrelevant to whether we ought to do it. That's surely reliable. On the other hand, if we don't do it, there is no action which we ought to have done. There is not an action which we ought to have done but did not do, because the action was not done and so does not exist. There is no action. If we don't do it, there is no action. Though perhaps there is an action which we ought not to have done. That would be a sin of omission. The action which I ought not to have done is not doing the action. As it were. So here's a worry. Is not doing it an action? Is not, yes. Not doing something is not the same as not doing something. You can't negate an action. Deciding not to do it is an action, but it's not the action we decide not to do. What about failing to do it? Is that an action? Not necessarily, one would feel. And then the obligation is there already before you do it. Before the performance, before the action is done, the obligation is already there. So the action we do can't really be somehow identical with the action which we ought to have done. There never was any such action as the action which we ought to have done. Okay, so this is the problem is beginning to kind of work itself up a bit. Now, initial worries about ought to be doneness as a rather odd property invented in Oxford in the 1940s or something can be addressed by understanding it simply as obligatoriness, or simply in terms of the contrast between being required and being forbidden. So being forbidden or wrong cannot be just a quality that the action would have if it were done. It must be able to be the reason why we don't do it. So there's a contrast here. Well, is that a difficulty? I can perfectly well avoid doing something because if I were to do it, the action would be wrong. Well, but if I don't do it, is there such a thing as the action I don't do? This is a metaphysical question. Lodek wants to say something, but I'm not going to let him. What is the it that is wrong? We might try saying that the reason not to do the action is that it would be wrong, not that it is wrong. And that try to get out of the worry that an action that isn't done can have properties. You say, if it were done, it would be wrong. But this seems to be what Pritchard is ruling out when he says the obligation cannot be a property which the action would have if it were done. Okay, so that's Pritchard. In my last book, Practical Shape, I read these thoughts of Pritchard as remarks about types or plurality. And on this reading, Pritchard is putting pressure on us to allow that we don't have an obligation to do this or that particular action. We only have an obligation to act in a certain way. And that obligation exists in advance of and independent of actual performance, whether we do it or not. So I was understanding Pritchard as promoting the idea in this argument that an obligation is not to do an action, but to act in a certain way. There being some difference between those two, because of course if you don't act, there is no action. You still have an obligation to what? Not to do that action which you didn't do, but to act in a certain way. And this act in a certain way thing is what this talk is about. We have an obligation to act in a certain way, and that obligation exists in advance of and independent of whether we actually do it, actual performance. Many different performances would count equally as meeting one's obligation. Acting as one ought, which should not therefore be identified as doing the thing which you ought to do, as it were. The obligation is not to do a particular action, but to act as. Similarly, I suggested a reason to act is not a reason to do this or that particular action. Many different actions will count as acting as the reason recommends, acting according to the reason, as it were. Since each of them would equally constitute doing what we have reason to do, or acting as we have reason to act. We talk of a reason so to act, but you don't often talk about that perhaps, but you might. And that shows that, if you like, the focus of the reason is not on some particular action which you may or may not do, but on a way of acting. But then, of course, the question becomes, what are those? These ways of acting, which are supposedly favored or not by reasons. What is it? That is, what is it to act in a certain way? So I took that, the question as applied to reasons, to be, if you like, the metaphysical question raised by the Pritchard point. What is a reason to do? Not some particular action, though when you do the particular action, the action is favored by the reason. And it's because it is favored by the reason that you're doing it. Still, the reason was not a reason, if you like, particularly to do this action. It had a wider thrust. It was a reason, as we say, I'm just repeating myself because it helps you get used to the idea. Right? It was a reason to act in a certain way, and many different actions will count as acting in that way. Each will count as acting in that way. So we have it that a reason is a consideration that favors acting in a certain way. And I have found grave difficulty in understanding how it is possible to favor such a thing. It counts against this reading of what Pritchard said, that he seems to speak without any sense of strain about a property which the action would have if it were done. And the easiest way of understanding that is as saying something about a supposedly individual or particular action. So it's not obvious that Pritchard definitely has in mind this contrast between an obligation to do a particular action and an obligation to act in a certain way. So my initial question in this talk is whether, on my reading, as it were, of what's going on here, whether there's a real issue, whether there's a problem here or not. Is that this question may have a bite independent of whatever Pritchard may have been trying to get at. One might simply ask oneself, without going through all this stuff I've just put you through, all the painful stuff about Pritchard, one might simply ask oneself directly, what is the right-hand side of the reason relation? That's surely a straightforward question. And the answer, an action, is incautious. Because there is no action which the reason is a reason to do. There's no action such that if you don't do it, you have not done what you had reason to do. Because you could have done a different action which would have still been of the same sort. Okay, that's by way of introduction. So this is metaphysics. Really, the metaphysics of the favoring relation. What's the thing on the right-hand side? We know what's on the left. Matters of fact. That you're late. We don't know what's on the right. Once you've done an action, then you can ask of that action whether it was an action in accordance with the reason. That's easy. But the reason why you did the action was that you had a reason so to act. And the focus of that so to act obviously takes you away from the particular case, the particular action you do. Since the reason favors any action of a certain sort. Singulatim, as the Latins say. Okay, so that's sort of what I'm facing in this talk, and let me tell you in advance that I don't have an answer to this question. But that's all right. In philosophy, it's all right. It's supposed to be good enough to see a problem. So that's what I'm trying to do. So now, how are we to move forward? What I'm going to do now is consider various points made to me by my graduate students at Austin when I put them through some of this material. I hope you don't think that's inappropriate because I've written their names down here. So I'm not pretending this was me. And it may even do them good to be. So the first suggestion about these issues was made by Duk-Hyun Lee, who said, Pritchard's argument has a false premise. So we can ignore it and turn our attention elsewhere. Let's rewrite the argument as an instance of modus ponens, and you see this on your sheet, I hope. First premise, the existence of an obligation to do an action cannot depend on the actual performance of the action. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to fail to do what you ought to do.
Well, I've been thinking about this, and one example. What if, say, like a software example, like parents doing something unselfish for the sake of their children.
Mm-hmm.
They're supporting their children. That action. That is.
Sorry, you perhaps you would prefer to take the questions.
Sure.
Well, it rather depends what sort of question it's going to be. I was taking it was sort of a suitable interruptory question, but I assume you think it's a...
It's kind of an obligation that is describing, that is a property of the action itself.
Well, as far as this premise goes, it just says the existence of the obligation to do the action, or the obligatoriness of the action, cannot depend on whether you do it or don't.
Oh, there's probably some non-trivial constructs that can.
Well, let me struggle on. That's to say, you wouldn't be able to prevent it from being a duty by refusing to do it. This is a way of understanding Pritchard, right? The second premise: if the existence of X does not depend on the existence of Y, then X cannot be a property that Y would have when and because Y exists, because that would be dependence. So, C, an obligation to do an action cannot be a property which that action would have if it were done. Now, this is supposedly a casting of Pritchard's argument, right? And you could say, you're not convinced it is a fair one, but for the moment, let's just run with it, as it were. So Ducky and Lee's objection was that P2 here is blatantly false. Recast it in terms of the redness of an apple. Redness is a property which cannot depend on the existence of a particular red apple, but is a property which the apple would have if it existed. Well, about that objection, I'm not sure that the talk of the existence of the redness of the apple, or redness in general, is appropriate. Though I allow that talk of the existence of an obligation is appropriate. There's no worry that the apple is not red because it exists, or something like that. So I think Duckian's attempt to rewrite Pritchard's argument doesn't work. I put it in because it shows you a sort of a strategy that you might use to try and recast the argument. So let's turn to the second such attempt, which is from Engel Horbecker, who likes to be known by his first half of his surname, Engel. He says, take Pritchard's argument and replace ought to be done in it with something non-normative, like about to be done. Actions have this property only when they are not being done, but will in fact be done. That seems true enough. I think we have to forget, for the purposes of this example, the fact that I can be about to do something which I don't go on to do because I was distracted by a ring on the bell. But then we'd say of the action that it was not, as a matter of fact, about to be done, though I was about to do it and then didn't. But perhaps this being about to read is a property of me rather than a property of the action. So it's a sort of distortion to say the action has the property of being about to be done. That property is really a property of me, not a property of the action. And of course, an action that isn't being done doesn't exist yet to be an action that is about to be done. Something seems to have gone wrong with the times there. So even if a property did depend on actual performance of the action, it might fail to be a property which the action would have if it were done. For if it were done, it would have lost the property of being about to be done. That's quite clever. You can check this by rewriting the argument, but I'm not sure whether I've got this on my handout. Yeah, I do. So here it comes again. This is sort of Pritchard rewritten in Modus Ponens talk. Whether one is about to do an action cannot depend on the actual performance of that action. Why not? Well, otherwise it would be impossible to fail to do what one was about to do. P2 star. If the existence of x cannot depend on the existence of y, then x cannot be a property that y would have when and because y exists. It's the sort of premise you look at in despair. So C, one's being about to do an action, cannot be a property which that action would have if it were done. Well, that conclusion looks true, whether it follows from the premises or not. But in fact, the argument looks valid. Still, is there such an action as the action that I was about to do? Is the phrase, that action, appropriate here? That was my original question. The other thing you might say is that Pritchard's problem is not obviously a problem about time, but Engel Horbecker didn't suggest otherwise. Now, one thing is worth putting in here is the thought that obligations are really properties of people, not properties of actions. H.W.B. Joseph, once another British moral philosopher at about the same time, who taught my father, obligatoriness is not a character of actions. There is no ought to be doneness or ought to be forbornness. To say that an act is obligatory means that the doing it is obligatory on me. The focus of the obligation is me, as it were, or you. So you can't ask whether the action has, as it were, in itself the quality of obligatoriness. The obligatoriness is a relation between the action and me. It really consists in my being bound to do this. But actions can be obligatory for people. There's nothing wrong with that. We understand. We hope we understand that. So let's try a third suggestion from Luke Gopnik. First, above C. C is a long way back now. It's at the. But C is an obligation to do an action cannot be a property which that action would have if it were done. Well, what Luke said is that is trivially true because obligations are not properties of actions, they're properties of people. But perhaps we could recast Pritchard's argument not in terms of obligations, but in terms of rightness. So the rightness of an action, we might say, cannot be a property that the action would have if it were done. And rightness is not a property of people, unlike obligatedness, as it were. Of course, actions that are not done have no properties at all. The rightness of an action cannot be a property which the action would have if it were done, since rightness is a property of people. Well, one could try replying like this. This trivializes Pritchard's point, when it, as it were, ruins it. The rightness of an action can perfectly well be a property that the action would have if it were done. It would be right if it were done. And it is right to do it before it's done. But when the thing is done, it's right. We might do the action because it would be right. It's not the same as saying we might do it because it is already right. We might have done it because it was the right thing to do. All that seems to work. Luke's second point was that C, let's go back to C, an obligation to do an action cannot be a property which that action would have if it were done. He says this is false anyway. It can be a property which the action would have if it were done. We need only suppose there are facts about who has what obligations, when, and only because there are facts about what properties their actions would have if they were so to act. And one might add, C, okay, so focusing on C, where's C gone? Yes, an obligation to do an action cannot be a property which that action would have if it were done. This is arguably false anyway, in a way that does not stem from P1 and P2. What Pritchard has done is to turn obligations as properties of people into properties of actions. Obligations as properties of people exist when, and only when, there are facts about what properties certain actions would have if they were performed. But the obligatoriness is not a feature of an action. We are really dealing with obligatedness, not obligatoriness. So that you've got to get the oblig bit into the right metaphysical slot. So here's a new reduction. One, you have an obligation to pay your taxes. Amounts to these two things. If and when you pay your taxes, if and when, your paying them will have the property of ought to be doneness. And if and when you fail to pay your taxes, your failure will have the property of ought not to be doneness. And with that reduction, P1 can be true. The existence of the obligation does not depend on actual performance. But the relevant version of C will be false. So, where are we? I do not persuade myself that this material is easy. But the basic point is not difficult. The interest of the Pritchard material for me is just a method of getting focused on the thing that I'm really after, which is what's on the right-hand side of the reasons relation, the favouring relation. What can we put there? I'm just going to repeat what I've said before because to sort of clear the air a bit. There is no action which I ought to do. There's no particular action which I ought to do, even though I have many duties and obligations. my obligations are to act in certain ways, to be careful about my family, not to be harsh with my students and so on. There's no particular action that I do which is the action which I ought to do. If there were, I would understand what's on the right-hand side of these normative relations, including the favouring relation. What is favoured is an action, this action. And then you have, if you like, a nice comprehensible normative relation between the situation and the action. All that works, and the features of the situation favour this action. And the action is itself a happy and comprehensible object. It's a thing. But when I haven't yet acted, there is no action, but I still have obligations. My obligations are to act in certain ways and not in other ways. And just as I have reasons to act in certain ways and not in other ways, I know what it is for a consideration to favour an action that has been done, because I've got an object here which can be favoured by the reason. But when the action hasn't yet been done, there is no object that is favoured. We say the reason is a consideration that favours acting in a way, but that thing on the right-hand side does not pick out an object. So we don't have a comprehensible normative relation between the reason on the left-hand side and something on the right-hand side favoured by the thing on the left-hand side. Or the thing on the right-hand side is just so acting, or acting in that way, and it's simply not obvious what that is. So worrying about the favouring relation when one worries about, what is it to favour and what does the favouring? When we say, all those things. And finding answers to those questions doesn't yet tell you the answer to the question of what's on the right-hand side. And there doesn't seem to be a comprehensible answer to that. The focus of the reason is not on a particular action, nor is it on a class of actions, or anything like that. And yet we all perfectly well understand what reasons do, in the sense that we know perfectly well how to act according to a reason. So what is it that the reason counts in favour of? This seems to me a perfectly good question in the metaphysics of reasons. And it's one to which I don't have an answer that I myself understand. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions. Please wait until you get the microphone. Tony?
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. This was food for thought. So I'm probably going to get completely lost in Pritchard's metaphysics here, but so a question of clarification. So some of the issues you talk about here, I thought along the way, I thought I could handle them by sort of type token distinctions, but then I was wondering, so when you talk about the type of action here, would you include in this sort of state a reference to the individual? So some of our actions seem to be impersonal, and I'm obliged to do them, but some are not. No, so
some of them are personal, and some of them are, as it were, somebody should do it, so I'll do it. But it's not the reason isn't as it were aimed at me. It's not my reason. It's just there is a reason.
There is, yeah.
You know, here he is on the ground, writhing and in pain.
And this is actually a problem in a sense, because if there is not this connection, it's not that obvious why it's a reason for me.
No.
So
On the other hand, if it's a reason, it's not particularly a reason for you,
Yeah.
but it is a reason for you to do it. So we have, as it were, a reason for me to do it, and we have a reason for me to do it, where it's the reason favours my doing it, and indeed everybody else's. So there might be reasons for me, as it were, agent-relative reasons. But whether there are or not, it seems to me I can get this puzzle up and running.
yeah, no, that's, yeah. Just a quick question too. So when you were talking about to what extent an action had the property of rightness and so on, no, but wouldn't one way to approach this be to say that there is a type of action, no, that has the property of rightness, no, and then it
No.
can be exemplified?
No, but you've just got to listen to yourself. There is a type of action that has the property of rightness. Now, how do you carve that remark up? Is it the type that has the property? Or is it there's a type of action that has the property of rightness?
Yeah, but I would say that the type of action, if you want, it has certain features, no? So, and these are the right-making features, no?
Absolutely. It has that.
So in this sense, you could talk about the rightness accruing to the type, and then you have the token, and the token would be exemplified by some other features, no? For instance, the fact that you are involved or something like that. No?
All right, but how is that supposed to help?
I'm not sure. So it's because it just seemed to me that you were sort of not talking about the rightness accruing to the type, you know, but
Well, of course, I am a particularist, but
yeah, that's true. Okay, sorry, I will.
But
leave
I mean, look, act in a certain way. That's a type. I'm a particularist, but I don't think there's no such thing as acting in a certain way. Of course, I don't, and I know perfectly well that my reasons do not, if you like, pick out a particular action already somehow constructed for me to do. It's not like that. What the reason does is pick out a feature that makes a difference to how I am to act, you know, all that stuff. So, you know, as it were, taking the matter metaphysically, we mustn't suppose somehow that the action is set up already as an object, because that's in a way just the question. We have reasons and obligations and so on to act, and I'm asking you what that thing is on the right-hand side of the relation, and it will of course be an action when I've done it. But the reason was sort of full and complete in its own nature long before I actually acted on it. So I can't express the metaphysical nature of the reason in terms of what I then go on to do.
Ingvar?
Yeah, since long, when people have asked me, can you put a label on yourself in normative ethics, then I have answered, yes, I can. I am a particularist. But I have taken you, especially your book, Ethics Without Principles, to mean that when I have taken the whole situation into account, then I know this is the right action. But the way you speak now, it seems to me to imply that I have misunderstood you a bit, or you changed yourself a bit, because now I should, I hear you say, I could only say, oh, I've taken my whole situation into account and I have a way of acting that is the right thing to do.
Okay, I'm sorry to have given that appearance. But in fact, the thing is, I think, entirely consistent with particularism. particularism tells you, or it doesn't tell you, it insists that what is a reason in one case may not be a reason in another, and so on. So let's just take a case where it is a reason.
Yeah.
The next day, I mean, another case, perhaps not, but this one it is. All right. Now that we now face the question: what is it a reason to do? And we hit the problems that I've been trying to talk about. The reason seems to be a reason to here, only here, not necessarily in other cases. A reason to act in a certain way. Let's say, pay your debt. You have not all whatever the reason you have to pay your debt might not be a reason in another case and everything, but here it is. So, what is the metaphysical structure of the particular case? That's the particularist expression of the question. The particular case is you have a reason to pay your debt. That sounds as if you have a reason to do an action, and the phrase "an action" looks as if it's a referring expression, pointing to an action, which you have a reason to do, and the reason is a reason in this case. That's the particularist bit. Right? Now, what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't look as if the right-hand side of the reason relation can itself be an action, even in the particular case, because the consideration that is a reason not for this or that particular act, but for any act of a certain sort, one that fits the reason. So you have a reason to pay your money back, but whether you do it with the right hand or the left hand is indifferent. Now, the reason is a reason to pay the money back. And when you do pay the money back, you have done what you had reason to do. But many other different acts would equally have constituted doing what you had reason to do. So the, if you like, focus of the reason is not on any particular action. It's on, and now we take a deep breath, doing some act or other of a certain sort. We say the reason favors what? It favors doing one or other of those actions.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, I'm sort of trying to work out how that works.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So the charge that this is not particularist, I hope I have escaped from.
Yeah, but I couldn't get what you have talked about now. It's impossible to read into ethics without principles. Am I right?
You can't get this. This debate is not in that book.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about Pritchard, or what Pritchard is doing in that quote.
Yeah, good.
So while I agree that there is something strange about how can we have a relation between a relata that doesn't sort of exist yet, and I also sort of agree about sort of how to individuate the particular action rather than acting in some sort of way. But I always thought that what Pritchard was doing in that text and in that quote is saying something more simple about anti-moral luck. So the actual should rather be sort of cannot possibly depend on the successful performance of action, because that would sort of be unfair because maybe we fail to do it. And that this would be in reply to what Ross in Right and the Good has this view that, well, you don't successfully discharge your obligation to return a book until the book is returned, regardless of what sort of happens. And Pritchard wants to argue against that thing.
Right. But I think that involves a mistake.
Okay.
It's true you haven't successfully It's true that you haven't successfully discharged your obligation until you have done what you ought to do. But there is no action which you ought to do. the obligation can be met in various ways. So the focus of the obligation is not on some particular act that is required of you. Ross would say this just as well as Pritchard.
Well, sure. But what I thought was Pritchard's point is that, well, since we can't control whether we will actually successfully return the book, we can't have an obligation to do it. Rather, we should have an obligation to sort of set ourselves.
Yes,
or
okay. But that is a different worry. I think completely different worry. But you're perfectly correct. Yes, it does say that. My obligation is to pack and post the book rather than to return it to its owner. So that's, I think, at the end of chapter 2. That's what you're thinking about.
Yeah.
But I think of that as orthogonal to this issue. Whatever it is that I am required to do, whether it be pack and post the book or return it to its owner, still what is required of me is not some particular packing or posting.
Sure, yeah, I agree.
Or getting back to owner. What is required of me is that I do an action of a certain sort. Namely, and that seems to mean that there is no action that is obligatory on me. And we cannot say that a sort of action is obligatory on me. But we can say that I have an obligation to act in a certain way. Oh dear. Go on, try.
Yeah, so I agree with everything, except I sort of want to push on. So, well, when we sort of set ourselves or intend to do something, we don't intend to act in a type of way, in a range. Rather, the level of description, the only ones that sort of intelligible to us is to pack the book, but rather than...
Okay, so that's good. I mean, you're, as it were, taking it that one can intend a particular action. So the sort of thing that can be the thing intended is the sort of thing that can be an action.
Yeah.
So this thing, this sort of lump, and one might say, well, I don't know how to intend a whole action so conceived. I can intend, I can only control things to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So Ross might say, well, look, it wasn't this particular packing and posting that was my duty. It was packing and posting. And any packing and posting will do. The action which is my prima facie duty is to pack and post. Now, having gone that far, have we addressed or not addressed the issue of, since the particularity of that which we have a duty to do? I would have thought that we're still facing the same questions. Nobody thinks that duty goes to, or the particularity of the action that you in fact do. It only picks out certain features of it. And any action that had those features would be fine as far as the duty is concerned. And now I'm up and running.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to sort of think more about it.
No, that was, you're right. And this is the right sort of way to move, I think. Yeah.
Matthias.
Oh. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for very, very interesting talk. So I have more like a general comment, I would say, and wonder what you think about this. So it's about the relation between actions and omissions, abstentions, and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, one common position, I think, is saying something like, well, have a reason to act. That's, well, we can understand that because acts are particulars, but omissions, what is that even? To omit to do something? I mean, you can do nothing.
It's a nothing.
Yeah, it's a nothing. But when I hear it, I'm thinking well, there seems to be, the omissions and actions seems to be quite similar, actually. Or at least reasons to do something or reasons to abstain from doing so. It seems to be quite similar. It's just the difference is more like, well, say that there is something funny going on in Malmö, so I have reason to go to Malmö. I can do that in a few different ways. I can take the train, the car, I don't know, bus. So there are a few different ways. It doesn't really matter which way I go to Malmö. I will, well, do what I had a reason to do. And you could say similar things, of course, about obligations.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to, well, omissions, so I have a reason not to steal something from Jacob, but I can do it in like a myriad of different ways. I can sit still, I can go and eat an ice cream, I can, yeah. So there are just more, omissions are like, there are just bigger, more ways of not...
They have less focus.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
No,
But it seems to be, they come together in a nice way when you think about reasons to,
they
reasons
do.
for actions and omissions. It seems to be the same.
Reasons not to
Yeah.
are like reasons to.
Exactly.
And they have all their strengths and weaknesses. So, a reason not to is a consideration that favours not. And reason to is a consideration that favours to.
Yeah.
And that's all fine. And now, sort of, what lies on the right-hand side of those relations, I want to ask, and now, aren't I back in my patter? That, there was no action. Or rather, you might say with reasons, the reason does not focus on any particular action. It focuses on a class of actions,
Right.
a type of response, and a reason is a reason to respond in that way. And on the cognitive side, a reason is a reason to believe in that way, or to believe that, but the believing is not particularized by the particularity of the thing believed. So this, I have to say, this all sounds like just what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
I mean, my job here is to try and persuade you that your job, in the sort of way in which we, sort of battle, protect. Your job is to show that this attempt to cast everything in terms of favouring responses of a certain sort is some kind of misreading of what's going on. And my job is to say, no, I got it.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
at
So I'm
the
not
moment,
doing my job.
No, I think you're not doing your job, and I am doing mine.
So if if I'm supposed to criticize, I think I would say something like, you seem to think that this is problematic to think about actions in this way, and I'm saying that, well, there is actually something good about thinking about actions in this way, because then you can see that they go along with abstentions and omissions. So,
yes, there is that. I mean, once you've seen the point in one part of the terrain, it begins to spread, and that's what you should expect. It seems to me. But the hard edge of the question is what is on the right-hand side of the favouring relation. That's the hard edge for me, and I don't know. And I don't think Ross knew either. But I don't think they've thought about this very much. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
No.
Okay, Patrick.
Hi, so if I'm getting the idea, you don't want to say that actions are on the right-hand side of the favoring relation because we get this problem. So, a reason favors an action, or that's what's favored in actions. And I guess I'm thinking that there's some kind of slippage in our thought and talk about actions. I mean, I think that maybe action is ambiguous in English. I think we've got a couple words like this that float around in philosophy, like event. I mean, this is a thing that sometimes we think of as like it's a concrete particular. It's like a thing's having a property at a time. That's an event. But often in English, it's like a fine thing to say, like, he predicted all these events would come to pass, but none of them did. Mm-hmm. It's a perfectly fine sentence. Similarly, like, we could have, something like, we were contemplating, you know, let's think about the actions we were contemplating yesterday. You know, yeah, I mean, under one sense of action, I mean, you know, that doesn't commit us at all to the idea that anything was done to that effect. But in another sense, I mean, if we were contemplating some actions yesterday, like if we were contemplating Daniel's actions yesterday, then of course, I mean,
They
those
might
are
be.
things that happened, right? So action, I mean, under one reading of action, it's kind of like, it's like it has a similar status like state of affairs, where you could, some of them obtain, some of them don't. So like, in that sense of action, I think then, yeah, I mean, why not say that reasons favor actions? And now some actions, have been performed, but I mean, in this kind of sense, like there, you know, at the end of time, we might say, look, there are millions of actions that never got performed, like jumping to the moon or something like this. You know, that's just one of these actions that never got performed. But there were reasons to do that. You know, there are things in favor of, you know, actions like this, but alas, you know, none of them got done. Just like we might regret that lots of states of affairs never got instantiated or something. So lots of actions never got done. That seems like a kind of fine thing to say to me.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Okay,
I'm not sure that it's relevant.
I see.
The favouring relation is intentional.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that that which is on the right-hand side of it need not exist
Yeah.
for the relation to obtain.
Yeah.
That's what you were saying,
Mm-hmm,
roughly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what then is on the right-hand side of a reason relation? The relation itself can obtain when there's nothing. Well, when nothing is done,
Yeah.
as it were. But still, that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't a reason.
Yeah.
Now, we can't say since there's no action there, there was no reason.
Right.
There was a perfectly good reason. That was the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the reason? A reason. Now off I go. To do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was to give the money back. Now, is that an action? Well, of course, in one, you know, of course, ordinarily you would say yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But metaphysically speaking, what is the nature of the thing on the right-hand side of the favouring relation? One wants to say an action, but this clearly is not a individuating a particular action.
No.
Because we know that many actually numerically distinct actions would equally well satisfy the reason.
Yeah.
So, as it were, the reason calls for or favours or whatever, you might say, does it favour each one of them, singulatim, one by one, as it were? That doesn't sound the right way to go. It seems to do its job all at once. So then that's why it's so convenient to say what it favours is acting in a certain way, because I've got it in my little lump, the favoured thing, acting in a certain way. And then there's wretched philosopher comes along and says, so what's that? And that's what I'm doing. How can something called acting in a certain way be understood as favoured by this consideration? Now, I'm not saying it clearly can't. I'm only wanting to know how it's supposed to work, because I mean, in a sense, you know, I'm keener than any of us to get this to work. But the fact that, I mean, by stressing the fact that the reason is a reason that would be satisfied by many distinct actions, and this is grist to my mill, because each of them equally well is an instance of acting as you have reason to act. Now that isn't a solution, it's the problem.
Okay. I have a different question.
We have time, so
Yeah,
you
we
may
have
ask
time, we have
another
time. Yep.
question.
Okay, I should go with that then. Okay, then I have perhaps more to say about the action, but yeah, it seems like you are okay with actions, like, you know, something like Daniel and I performed the same action, you know, like that's a fine thing to say. There is some sense of action in which, you know, you and I have done, you know,
We
the
both
same-
did it. We both did it yesterday.
yeah,
Mm.
performed the same action.
Mhm.
Of course, under some kind of interpretation of action,
It's fine.
that's a contradiction, but under some other sense it is.
Mhm.
So yeah, then that would have. It's like action in the multiply exemplifiable sense. We get to beyond the favoring relation. It's like that's what's on the
Right-hand side.
right hand side.
Yeah. And
But yeah.
it once the action's been done, everything's in place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but until you have acted, there's a perfectly good reason doing its stuff, which is satisfied by any of a wide variety of different actions.
Yeah.
Now, how are we to understand what the reason is doing? Is it asking you to act in one of those ways? And I just put that as a possible suggestion. Or is it asking you, and this is the way I sort of was expressing it, to act in a certain way? So it being understood that many different actions would constitute acting in that way.
Mm-hmm.
That would seem to me the most promising and natural thing to say.
Yeah.
And I do think that's the thing we really should say. But the trouble is understanding it. Because that which is favoured, well, I'm just going over it all again, which is I suppose bound to happen in this talk. It's very hard to think of the favouring relation as aimed at something of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
That's the puzzle. At least that's how I see the puzzle.
Should I ask the other question, or do I have time?
We have.
Pots of
Well,
time.
we can take two other questions before, and then I'll get back to you if there is time. Vlodek.
Yeah, no, sorry. The first kind of piece of personal history.
Okay.
Right? So, long time ago, I think the end of the 80s, I formulated a principle which I called the principle of normative invariance. And the principle said that the normative status of an action cannot depend on whether it is performed or not. And then, some years later, it was pointed out to me that Pritchard was first, right? So I was proud of the principle, but then...
Well, you could still be proud of it, because
it's funny.
you did as well as Pritchard.
Yes, but at least now I have the name for it, principle of normative invariance. So it's kind of, it applies not just obligatoriness, ought to be doneness, rightness, kind of any kind of normative status. Right?
Reasons.
But, of course, to accept such a principle, then it has to be the case that what keeps the same status, whether it's done or not, must exist also when it's not done, right? Right. So when you talk about actions here, of course, this cannot be the particular action, right? So it must be some kind of abstract entity, right? Then that is being instantiated or not instantiated in reality, right? In real life. So this is what is being favored, right? But then you say, but you don't understand. What does it mean that a kind of abstract object is being favored?
That's
right?
exactly
Yes,
that's what I want to
yes,
say.
and I think that this is a real problem, right? Just not the kind of identifying, because it's, as you say, it's acting in a certain way. It's a kind of abstract thing. But what would you say if one said, well, this is kind of, when we say that the reason favors X, right? Then we actually should say something like, this reason favors instantiating X. Right? So the relation is favors instantiating, and then X is something abstract, right? So
Okay.
that is on the right-hand side, something abstract. But it's not X that is being favored, but instantiating X is that is being favored, right?
Well, yeah. Can you favor X in this
Well,
picture?
Yeah, maybe I can favor if I'm Platonist.
All right, but I'm sort of real.
I admire the ideas, but this is not the kind of thing that we are talking about here, right?
No, that's right.
So you are not favoring an abstract
Entity,
entity.
and you're not
right?
favoring a concrete entity.
Yeah, well, you can favor a concrete entity, and the reason favor when it's
Done, once it's done.
Done, right? So it's but it inherits something, right? Yes, but,
Yeah.
but otherwise, generally, what is the kind of the relation here is favors instantiation of, right? And then reason is on the left-hand side, abstract entity is on the right-hand side, right? Yes.
It favors instantiating a type, essentially.
Yes, yes, so kind of, yes, yes. So we are sort of going round here, right? Yes, well, trying to say something that I guess everyone agrees with.
Okay, so now the question for me is whether this same problem occurs at second intention. So if one said a reason is a reason to instantiate a type, now there can be many different instantiations of that type,
Yes.
and the reason favors them all equally.
Well, the reason, well, perhaps one could specify some instantiation of a type, right? So it's not obvious that it favors every instantiation of the type, because there may be too many, right? Yes, but what is being instantiated is that this type, what is being favored is that this type is being instantiated, right?
And that's now. All right. So the question is this an answer to the problem, or is it just the same thing again?
Yes, it could be.
And one might say there are many different instantiations of this type,
Sure.
all equally favored by the reason,
Yes.
and the reason doesn't distinguish between them.
No.
What it favors is doing one or the other.
Yes.
if you like. And you say, well, you can recast that as what it favors is instantiating the type.
Or rather that it's a relation of favoring instantiation of, where the type is one relatum and reason is the other relatum, right?
Okay. Which instantiation? It doesn't favor any instantiation particularly.
No,
It favors
instantiation of.
instantiating.
Yes,
Right. Is that an action?
Sorry, what is?
Instantiating a type. That could be an action. I
Yes,
suppose.
as a particular. As,
Yeah.
so there, one could talk about actions as abstract entities and
All right,
that
okay.
exist, can exist without obtaining, right? But,
So is
without
it that it favors all instantiations of the type, or
well,
that it favors?
some instantiation, but not a specific one, but that kind of, that there would be at least
that
one,
you should?
right?
Aha. Okay.
Because
That's
I
not
don't think that when you should post and packet or whatever,
It's-
then
that's
you
not the
should
point, yeah.
do lots of
No,
all
all right.
of them. So just one.
It's a bit odd to think of a reason as favouring an instantiation of a type, but still, that maybe oddity is the cost.
Yeah, no, so there's certainly problems.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'm not sure what to say about that. Okay.
Tony has a follow-up before I go to the next.
So I'm very much in favor of this way of looking at it as well. No, but I'm just thinking that in one sense, your way of understanding type makes perfectly sense, and that's a normal way of understanding type as a sort of general entity. No, but it's not necessarily the only way of understanding a type. No, so one way of understanding type would be an extremely specific sort of entity that's sort of just left out the fact that it was Tony that was doing it, but the act that I did could then be performed by Björn. No? And the only thing that different was that that this type. So in one way, you need an argument for saying that there are all these different things, different ways of doing things. No, it could actually be like this, that the facts of the matter pointed out just one way of doing the things. No, I'm not saying that's the more perfect one,
I was
but
imagining,
it will still be possible to talk about type and instantiations of actions.
I was just imagining they can always find two, if you try.
Yeah, but it could be it need not be then a matter of sort of a sort of, but it would be different reasons somehow. Okay, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
There's an argument wanting here, no? So for why we should talk about it in this general way.
Okay.
So it might make perfect sense to talk about it, but one way of getting out of these problems would be to say that each situation picks out just one way of instantiating this type.
You gave me the microphone, so I thought you.
Just do that again, though. Each situation picks out one way of instantiating the type.
And the type is an extremely specific sort of thing.
I mean, can you get a type to be specific enough to do that?
Yeah.
Can you show me how you do that?
Just pick out the individual doing it, and then
But you can't. Well, you can't do that in advance. Yeah.
say that now describe the action.
But we can't. Look, hang on. We haven't got the action yet. We're at the stage of having a reason and going to act shortly.
If it's you're asking for an explanation, and there are surely actions done, so I could find one and then I could explain it.
Well, there will be, but the reason is there before the action, and it has its own nature. I feel that what's happening here is that you're somehow using the particularity of the action once it gets done to tell me what the reason was doing, and I'm not convinced that that's a strategy that I welcome. But perhaps I've it doesn't sound like what. Well, of course, that's very, very good in every respect, but
We could get back to this after a few other questions.
Thanks for a very clear lecture. So I'm sorry if I missed something obvious.
So am I.
And I think it might follow up with what was just said. I was just wondering why the action can't be part of a more narrative, fictional, structuralist sort of view of reality, where the ontology maybe shifts, because if you consider that an action will always require a description, then a narrative or a structuralist view of an action might make sense. And then I don't see why the ought to have doneness can't stick to that version of the action.
Say the same about reasons. That's a request. Can you make the same point, not about oughts, but about reasons?
So that reasons would also be part of a structuralist narrative ontological view of the world.
I'm struggling to see how that generates an answer to the puzzle I thought I was dealing with.
Okay.
The narrativity of the narrative structure of the engagement, as it were, doesn't seem to me to yield a suitable understanding of what the reason, of the nature of that which the reason is a reason to do, which helps me understand the metaphysics of the scenario as a whole. So I'm not, I mean, this is just me saying I don't get it yet. Talking about narrativity or narrative structures and so on is very helpful in all sorts of ways, but I'm not convinced yet that it addresses the problems that I thought I was gripped by.
Okay.
Let the structure be narrative. That, if you like, casts the question, what is a reason to do in a certain frame? But doesn't seem to generate much of an answer. The answer is whatever answer can be got into that frame. It's got to be got into that frame. So, the reason is there long. I mean, look, I just go through my stuff. The reason is there long before the action is done. So it's very hard to understand the identity of the reason in terms of the identity of the action that is done for that reason.
Okay. So I was just thinking, if the reason, the action already exists in the sort of collective conscience or in an imagination, so then the reason can exist.
Yeah, all right. But what if it? Often enough, one says, I have a reason to help out here, but I simply have no idea how to go about doing that. How could I help? You're in distress. I'm in a position to help, so I've got some reason to help. But until I, if you like, start helping, there isn't enough event for a narrative structure to get its teeth into. Sorry, my metaphors have got out of control there, but I'm as keen on narrativity as anybody else, I hope, since it seemed to offer all sorts of riches. But I'm not sure that it actually engages with the puzzle I was talking about, or trying to.
Thought I'd try it out on you.
Yeah, all right. It looks as if the narrativity. There's a narrative story, and certainly once the action is done, then there's a lovely narrative. But before that, there was a situation which itself is narratively conceived, and the reasons thrown up by that. Have reasons you have because of the nature of the situation. The narrativity doesn't change any of that, does it? If so, I'm lost. Talking of narrative structures is not a way of avoiding talk about reasons, is it? It's really a way of giving an enriched account of how the story is to be told, isn't it? Okay.
Okay, sorry I interrupted you, Tony and Jonathan. Do you want to? But if you want to say something, please do it in the microphone.
Hello. No. So I actually was just a question of clarification, because I do think that a situation can be, the fact can be sort of calling for a certain action in a very, very specific way, and
that's true.
And then you sort of need an argument for why all reasons are on this type are sort of a general account now, and I think
But for,
So you were actually invoking these general when you were answering Blodig, and I think that one way of avoiding some of the issues you've had with Blodig would be to say that, you know, maybe it's like this, that facts are extremely specific when it comes to reasons. No, I'm not saying I have an argument for this, but it might be like that.
all right, so we have various terms here: specific, general,
Yeah.
particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we sort of got to be very careful with the way they're operating.
Yeah, especially with our Harrian past here.
Yeah. Now, we know that we're dealing with a highly specific situation. That to say, it's a detailed.
Yeah.
But highly specific just means detailed. It doesn't mean it doesn't get you to a particular action until something is done. There is no such action until something is done.
So on this we are.
surely that's all right.
So that's
Yeah,
we
all
have
right.
no. I have no problem.
So the reason we're dealing with is a reason calling for a response of a certain highly detailed type. No?
No, because so I agree with that, but you could say that there is this detail could be a sort of a reason for instantiating a certain type, no? A very specific certain style.
No, however detailed is the type in question, you could always think of different
Way
ways
of doing it.
doing it. So you
Yeah,
can-
as it were, you can't escape
Yeah, no.
typeness
Yeah,
by
yes,
talking about detail.
right.
Yeah, so you're still at the level of types. So complicating the nature of the response called for doesn't get you away from multiple instantiability. Okay. Well, that, I mean, Blodik's on my side. That's 2 to 1. This time.
All right, Patrick.
I wanted to come back to something in the original Pritchard quote, and then also something that you seem to want to say. You want to say that obligations seem to be properties of people, not of actions. But there's something just prima facie puzzling to me about this, because I would have thought that it's a category mistake to say that obligations are properties. So what could it mean? I mean, people have obligations, but people have grandparents, people have favorite numbers, things like this. But grandparents aren't properties. I mean, they're things. I mean, so obligations are, you know, just aren't properties. They're, well, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, but it's
No,
It's
you're
not-
right.
it's
An obligation is being obliged is a property.
yeah, being obliged. So right. So it's, I mean, but being obliged is a property of a person, sure. But I mean, I don't see why certain actions in this kind of sense that we've been discussing, where, you know, certain actions are ones that have gotten done, others aren't. You know, just like some states of affairs are instantiated, some haven't. I mean, some actions are such that they're obligatory, or
Well-
there's so I mean, certain actions, I think, yeah, they could have this type of property of being such that it's obligatory for those actions to be performed by someone or other, or maybe even by some person in particular. Some person in particular could be obligated to perform a particular action, in which case that particular action is obligatory, has a property. I mean, it's the property of the action being
Look,
obligatory.
Okay, you're obligated to do a particular action because you can
Yeah.
only do particular actions. You can't do any other sort of action.
Sure.
And there are no non-particular actions.
Yeah.
But it doesn't follow from that there are particular actions that you are obligated to do,
Okay.
because
okay.
the obligation may allow various ways of being met.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you want to say there's, I mean, it's a bit, I think, okay, so some actions are such that it's obligatory that they are performed, but no particular action is such that it's obligatory that it's performed.
Yeah.
There's some kind of
You have a
scope
duty
distinction.
to give the money back, but that thing on the right-hand side is like a general specification of how you are obligated to behave yourself, as it were. And I mean, in a sense, you might say you have a duty to make sure that one of your actions is of the giving the money back sort.
Yeah.
That's a very obviously stupid way of putting it, but
Yeah.
I mean, but it stresses the sense that the action you do is, of course, particularized only by being done. Whereas the obligation had its own nature, you know, in a way that seemed independent of the action by which you chose to meet it.
Yeah, that seemed clear. Yeah.
Jakob?
Yeah, if I could just ask some sort of philosophical housekeeping question, because you keep talking about sort of the right-hand side of the
Yes.
reason relation, and that sort of seems to imply that you view the reason relation as sort of just having two relata as a fact and an action,
Does rather, yes. I
rather
suppose.
than a free-placed relation, or
Yeah. No, there's a person as well,
there's a person as well. Yeah.
but I wasn't. Just kept that out of it.
Oh, good. And finally, something that you sort of claimed was very important in your talk, but didn't say anything about, is keeping the favoring relation, keeping it carefully distinct from adjacent relations.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could say something about the fittingness relations, or sort of why the sort of fittingness first program fails, understanding reasons as premises of good reasoning or whatever it is.
Is that fittingness?
Well, the fittingness first approach is saying, well, for something to be a reason, is it to be premises of fit preserving? I don't know.
I mean, look,
That's
I
up to
suppose,
you.
I suppose what I think is that the fittingness relation is a
Yeah.
different relation from the favouring relation.
Uh-huh.
And it may be that they work like that. The action fits the situation favours the action. Now, so that, you know, we can put them both on the map. And as far as that goes, I suppose, okay, let's as it were, not forget the fact that the action fits the structure of your obligations, as it were, and that the situation calls for the action. I mean, as far as that goes, one could simply say that's the story. Now, I suppose that's, in my most conciliatory mode, that's what I would say.
And in your least conciliatory?
I'm wary of it seems to me that favouring is a more revealing conception than fitting, roughly. Counting in favour of, well, look, what's the model of fit? You know,
Yeah.
something. You know. You know, this fits that and that fits this. It's a two-way relation. The favouring is a one-way relation. I like that bit of it. So I mean, if somebody said to me, your reasons here fitted what you did, and I would think, yes, but they did. There's no doubt about it.
In the best scenario, yeah.
In the best scenario, yeah, well, in a good case. And that's fittingness in the wrong direction. Whereas, but there is a relation of fit, which it is symmetrical. And I'm thinking of reasons as pointing the way. This is all terribly bad philosophy, but it's pointing the way. I like, go do it. And the favouring relation sort of gives me that without too much strength. It's not a duty-making thing, it's a reason. Now, certainly, if you act, nobody need deny that there's fittingness, right? The question here, perhaps, is simply which metaphor you find most revealing as to the ways in which normative distinctions are driven by the relationship between situations and responses.
Does that mean that you're also sort of not keen on understanding fittingness in terms of reasons?
I would have thought the whole point of fittingness was not to do that.
Well, yeah.
So, I mean, if I understood fittingness in terms of reasons, if I could get away with it, then that would be one thing. But supposing I can't get away with it, then there's going to be some aspect of fittingness that is not explicable in that way. And I don't think I have to, I'm not, condemned to denying that possibility. It's more a matter of stress than exclusion. So evidently there is fittingness. How could anybody deny it? But the question is exactly where you put it in the structure of the. That's all I can say.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks.
That was a good question.
Blorek, you looked like you wanted to add something to this.
So yes, of course, there are those fittingness first people, right? But, and one reason they seem to have is that they want to avoid the wrong kind of reasons problem for the fitting attitude account, right? Yes.
Yeah.
But I think that they don't, right? Because they, in the same way, as there are reasons of the wrong kind, or the good reasons, but of the wrong kind in the context of value analysis, there is also fittingness that is of the wrong kind in the context of value analysis. So, for example, it can be fitting to have a certain liking or kind of some pro-attitude towards the object, but which has nothing to do with the features of the object, but rather with the ontological requirements on the subject, right? Yes. So fittingness can also work in this way.
In the wrong way.
In the wrong way. So I don't think that Jonathan Way and that they really have opened a new
door. Yeah, okay.
That is really
Okay, so thank you so much for this.
Thank you all very much
fantastic
for listening to
lectures. It has been extremely interesting and increasingly difficult. You really managed to get us to think about these matters.
Well, it's true that the third one was more difficult than the previous two.
Yeah. You told us that native speakers of English are not allowed to want that P, but I think I want that Martin, our head of department, approaches you and expresses the gratitude of the department.
I can only agree with Björn. These have been extremely interesting and thought-provoking lectures. Thank you so much.
No, thank you all.
I'm not in this particular field myself, but your lectures made me want to be.
Oh.
So I think that's a great compliment.
Thank you very much.
One can pay. And as per tradition, I want to extend a token of appreciation to you on behalf of the Department of Philosophy in Lund. Here is the Pufendorf Commemorative Medal. Thanks so much.
Well, I have to say something. Come on, shut up. This is a very great honor that you have done me. I looked at the list of previous recipients of this medal and I felt very small, but a little bit bigger than I had been before. So it's a heartwarming and self-affirming thing. It's lovely. most academics work away very hard, and occasionally people are nice about what they do. But this is something that I will always treasure and make me feel better in the bad days. So thank you very much indeed to you all.